Listen, this story, this godforsaken tale of ice and blood and broken promises, it needs to be told. It needs to be screamed into the void until someone, anyone, understands what it means to be cast aside like refuse, to be deemed unworthy by the very people who were supposed to protect you. This is the story of Isidora Halver, and damn it all, this is the story of every soul who has ever been told they weren't enough. 24 years. 24 years of breathing, existing, surviving in a world that would rather pretend she didn't exist at all. That's how long Isidora had walked this earth before the day everything changed, before the day a dying wolf collapsed at her feet and tore open every wound she'd spent years trying to cauterize with solitude and silence. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm getting ahead because the rage, God, the rage, it builds up in my throat like bile, and I want to spit it all out at once. I want to make you feel every single moment of abandonment, every whisper behind cupped hands, every pitying glance that told her she was broken. I want you to understand what it's like to be an omega in a world that worships strength, that venerates alphas and their brutal dominance, that has no place, for someone like her. The mountains. The frozen, merciless mountains where she'd made her exile. That's where our story begins, in a landscape as barren and unforgiving as the hearts of those who'd cast her out. Picture it, endless expanses of white, snow falling in sheets so thick you can't see 3 feet ahead, wind that howls like the damned, cold that seeps into your bones and makes a home there, refusing to leave. This was Isidora's world. This was her punishment for being born wrong. Born wrong. Can you imagine? Can you wrap your mind around what that does to a person? To be told from the moment you take your first breath that you are fundamentally, irrevocably defective? That your very existence is a disappointment? She was an omega. In the hierarchy of shifters, that put her at the bottom, beneath the alphas who led with iron fists and sharper teeth, beneath the betas who followed and enforced and made themselves useful. Omegas were supposed to be valuable too, in their own way. They were supposed to be nurturers, bearers of children, sources of comfort and stability for their packs. But Isidora? Isidora's wolf had never emerged. Her heat cycles had never come. She was an omega in name only, a shell, a fraud, a cruel joke played by biology or fate or whatever sadistic force governed their world. And so they'd whispered. Oh, how they'd whispered. Broken, they called her. Defective. Useless. Never to her face, of course, that would require acknowledging her existence directly, and that was apparently too much to ask. No, they whispered behind her back, in corners and corridors, their voices carrying just loud enough for her to hear, to know, to feel their contempt settling over her like a shroud. She'd left. Of course she'd left. What choice did she have? Stay and endure their pity? Stay and watch as every other omega found their place, their purpose, their mates, while she remained fundamentally alone? No. No, she'd taken what little pride she had left and fled to the mountains, to this frozen wasteland where at least the cold was honest in its cruelty, where the isolation was a choice rather than an infliction. 5 years. 5 years she'd survived in these mountains, and the word survived is doing a lot of heavy lifting there. She'd built a cabin with her own 2 hands, a rough, small thing that leaked when the snow melted and groaned under the weight of winter storms, but it was hers. She'd learned to hunt, to trap, to find the stubborn plants that grew in the brief, brutal summers and preserve them for the endless winters. She'd learned to be alone. And she'd convinced herself she was content. Convinced herself that this half-life of solitude was better than the alternative, that being forgotten was preferable to being remembered as a failure. She'd built walls around her heart, walls as thick and impenetrable as the mountains themselves, and told herself she was safe behind them. Lies. All lies. But lies we tell ourselves to survive, and who am I to judge? We all have our survival mechanisms, our ways of enduring the unendurable. Hers was isolation. Hers was convincing herself that she didn't need the pack, didn't need the connections that other shifters took for granted, didn't need the very things that made her kind pack animals in the first place. But the universe, cruel, capricious thing that it is, had other plans. It was a day like any other, which is to say it was a day of quiet desperation dressed up as routine. Isidora had woken before dawn, she always did, her body attuned to the rhythms of survival rather than comfort. She'd stoked the fire that had burned down to embers overnight, feeling the familiar ache in her muscles from sleeping on a too-thin mattress, from the constant tension of existing in a place that wanted her dead. The cold was particularly vicious that morning. She could feel it pressing against the cabin walls, seeping through the gaps she'd tried so hard to seal, making its presence known in every breath that misted before her face. Winter in the mountains was always harsh, but something about that day felt different. Felt worse. The air had that quality that preceded a storm, heavy, expectant, almost electric with potential violence. She'd gone out anyway. She had to. Her traps needed checking, and the small store of firewood she'd built up was running low. In the mountains, you didn't have the luxury of waiting out your anxieties. You pushed through, or you died. Simple as that. The snow was already falling when she stepped outside, not the gentle, picturesque snowfall of children's stories, but the angry, driving snow that stung exposed skin and obscured vision. She'd wrapped herself in every layer she owned, furs she'd trapped and cured herself, rough wool that scratched but held heat, boots lined with rabbit fur. She looked like some wild thing herself, more beast than woman, and maybe that was appropriate. Maybe that was what she'd become in her exile. She'd checked 3 traps, 2 empty, one with a snow hare that had died overnight, when she felt it. A presence. Something watching. Her hand had gone instinctively to the knife at her belt, her body tensing, every sense suddenly sharp and focused. In the mountains, being watched usually meant being hunted, and she'd learned long ago not to ignore that crawling sensation between her shoulder blades that said predator. But the forest remained still. Silent except for the whisper of wind through bare branches, the soft hiss of falling snow. No movement. No sound. Just that feeling, that certainty that she wasn't alone. She'd almost convinced herself she was being paranoid. 5 years of isolation could do that, make you jumpy and suspicious of shadows, when she saw it. Him. It. The wolf. And not just any wolf. A massive creature, larger than any wolf had right to be, with fur as black as the spaces between stars. He was collapsed in the snow, his great body heaving with labored breaths, steam rising from his muzzle in ragged plumes. Blood stained the white ground around him, so much blood that Isidora's first thought was that he must be dead, that this was just the body's final convulsions before stillness claimed it. But he wasn't dead. His eyes found hers, amber eyes, brilliant and pain-filled and somehow aware in a way that made her breath catch. This was no ordinary wolf. This was a shifter. Had to be. The size alone told her that, but those eyes confirmed it. Those were the eyes of something that thought, that understood, that knew. She should have run. Every instinct of self-preservation she'd honed over 5 years of solitary survival screamed at her to turn around, to flee back to her cabin, to bar the door and pretend she'd never seen this dying creature. Getting involved with another shifter, especially one this large, this powerful, was asking for trouble. Was inviting the very world she'd fled back into her carefully constructed isolation. But she didn't run. And isn't that just the damnedest thing? Isn't that just the cruelest twist of fate? Because in that moment, looking into those amber eyes, feeling something shift and stir in her chest, something that had been dormant for so long she'd almost forgotten it existed, she made a choice. A terrible, wonderful, life-altering choice. She moved toward him. Dropped to her knees in the blood-stained snow, her hands already reaching out to assess the damage. And oh, the damage. Silver poisoning. She could see the blackened wounds, could smell the acrid, wrong scent of silver burning through shifter flesh. Someone had shot him, multiple times, from the look of it, with silver bullets designed to kill his kind. "Who did this to you?" she'd whispered, and wasn't that ridiculous? As if he could answer. As if a dying wolf could tell her what enemies hunted him, what conspiracy had led to him bleeding out in her forest. But then something happened. Something that changed everything. When her fingers touched his fur, when her skin made contact with his, even through the blood, even through the poison, she felt it. Felt her. Her wolf. The part of herself she'd been told didn't exist, the aspect of her nature that had remained stubbornly silent for 24 years. She felt her stirring, waking, responding to this stranger in ways she'd never responded to anything. The sensation was overwhelming. It was like discovering a limb she didn't know she had, like suddenly being able to see a color that had previously been invisible. Her wolf was there, had always been there, and she was screaming. Not in pain or fear, but in recognition. In joy. In something that felt terrifyingly like completion. Mate. The word echoed in Isidora's mind, in her wolf's consciousness, and she wanted to reject it, to push it away, to deny what every instinct was telling her. This couldn't be possible. She was broken. She was defective. She didn't get to have a mate. She didn't get to have this fundamental connection that other shifters took for granted. And yet. The wolf whimpered, a sound of such profound suffering that it cut through her spiral of denial like a blade. He was dying. Right here, right now, this creature, this shifter, this possible mate, was dying in the snow, and she could either help him or watch him fade. The storm was picking up. She could feel it in the way the wind shifted, in the increased fury of the snowfall. Within an hour, maybe less, visibility would be zero. The temperature would plummet even further. If she was going to do something, anything, it had to be now. "You're too big," she told him, her voice steady despite the chaos raging inside her. "You're too heavy, and I'm too weak, and this is insane. But I'm going to try anyway. Do you understand? I'm going to try to get you to my cabin." Those amber eyes blinked slowly, and she could have sworn she saw understanding there. Gratitude. Maybe even hope. Hope. What a cruel thing to offer. What a dangerous thing to feel. She'd fashioned a makeshift sled from branches and her own cloak, working with numb fingers and racing heartbeat. The whole time, her mind was screaming at her to stop this madness, to leave him, to save herself. But her hands kept working, kept binding and securing, preparing to drag this massive wolf through a blizzard to a cabin that was barely adequate for keeping one person alive, let alone two. Getting him onto the sled was a nightmare. Even weakened by blood loss and poison, he was enormously heavy. She'd had to use every trick she knew, leverage, momentum, sheer stubborn determination, to roll his body onto the makeshift transport. By the time she'd secured him, her muscles were screaming, her breath coming in harsh gasps that burned her lungs. And then began the journey. The most physically brutal, emotionally devastating journey of her life. Pulling the sled was like trying to move a mountain. Every step was agony. The snow was deep and getting deeper, the sled runners catching on hidden obstacles, the wolf's weight threatening to drag her backward down the slope she was trying to climb. Her shoulders felt like they were being pulled from their sockets. Her legs trembled with exhaustion. Her hands, even through thick gloves, were going numb from gripping the makeshift rope she'd created. But worse than the physical pain was the mental torment. With every step, doubt assailed her. What was she doing? Why was she risking her life for a stranger? This wolf could be a criminal, could be dangerous, could be the very thing she'd fled to the mountains to escape. And even if he wasn't, even if he was exactly what her wolf insisted he was, what then? Did she really want to open herself up to that kind of vulnerability? To the possibility of being rejected, of being found lacking, of being abandoned all over again? "Maybe I'm not broken," she gasped into the howling wind, not even sure why she was speaking aloud except that the sound of her own voice was something to focus on besides the pain. "Maybe I'm just beginning." The words felt like a prayer and a curse all at once. A plea to whatever forces governed their world that she might be more than she'd been told. A recognition that this moment, this insane, desperate act of salvation, might be the first step toward becoming someone new. Her wolf agreed. She could feel her now, a constant presence in the back of her mind, lending strength that Isidora didn't know she possessed. Every time her legs threatened to give out, every time she wanted to collapse in the snow and surrender to exhaustion, her wolf pushed her forward. "Mate," she whispered. "Our mate. Save him. Save us." The cabin appeared through the snow like a mirage, and Isidora felt tears freeze on her cheeks, whether from relief or exhaustion or sheer overwhelming emotion, she couldn't say. Getting the wolf inside was another battle, one that left her sprawled on the floor beside him, gasping for air, her entire body one massive ache. But they'd made it. Against all odds, against all reason, they'd made it. She'd built up the fire until it roared, had stripped away her wet outer layers with shaking hands, and then, because there was no time for modesty or hesitation, she'd begun the work of saving him. Extracting silver bullets was delicate, dangerous work. One wrong move and she could poison herself. Could make his injuries worse. Could kill him. But her hands were steady. Her wolf guided her, lending instincts she'd never had access to before, showing her where to cut, how deep to go, what to avoid. The bullets came out one by one, 7 in total, each one making her angrier. Someone had tried to execute this shifter. Had pumped him full of silver and left him to die in agony. What kind of monster did that? What kind of betrayal led to this? She'd cleaned the wounds with whiskey, the last of her precious supply, and packed them with herbs she'd gathered during the summer. Yarrow to stop bleeding. Comfrey to promote healing. Garlic to prevent infection, though she wasn't sure if that would work on a shifter. She'd done everything she knew how to do, and then she'd wrapped him in every blanket she owned and waited. That's when the transformation happened. She'd been sitting beside him, her hand resting on his fur, feeling the slow but steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath her palm, when his body began to shimmer. To shift. She'd jerked back, startled and afraid, as his form melted and reformed, bones lengthening, fur receding, muscle and sinew rearranging themselves into a human shape. And what a shape it was! Even unconscious, even wounded and pale from blood loss, the man before her was the most magnificent creature she'd ever seen. Tall, impossibly tall, even lying down. Broad-shouldered and heavily muscled, with black hair that fell past his shoulders and a face that looked carved from granite. Scars marked his skin, old wounds that told stories of battles survived, of challenges met and overcome. This was no ordinary shifter. The power radiating from him even in unconsciousness told her that. This was someone important. Someone whose death would matter, would be noticed, would have consequences that rippled far beyond this small cabin in the frozen mountains. She'd covered him, because even in her shock, modesty demanded it, and then she'd simply stared, trying to reconcile this powerful being with the dying wolf she'd dragged through a blizzard. Trying to understand what cosmic joke had brought him to her, of all people. Her, the broken Omega. Her, the cast out and forgotten. Her, who had no business being anyone's salvation. He'd shifted in his sleep, a sound escaping his lips that might have been a groan of pain or something else entirely. And then he'd spoken. One word. One single, devastating word that changed everything. Mate. The bond snapped into place like a physical thing. Like chains wrapping around her heart, her soul, her very essence. She could feel him now, feel his pain as if it were her own, feel the spark of life that refused to be extinguished, feel the pull toward him that transcended logic or reason or self-preservation. The mate bond. The thing she'd been told she would never have. The connection that defined shifter relationships, that made two souls into one. It was real. It was here. It was hers. And she was terrified. Because this was exactly what she'd feared. This was vulnerability incarnate, was the possibility of pain on a scale she couldn't imagine. If she accepted this bond, if she let herself believe in it, she was opening herself up to devastation. What happened when he woke up and saw who she was? An Omega with no pack, no status, no worth? What happened when he realized the universe had made a mistake, had bound him to someone so far beneath him that it was laughable? She'd spent the night in turmoil, alternating between watching him breathe and pacing the small confines of her cabin like a caged animal. Her wolf was ecstatic, practically singing with joy at having found their mate. But Isidora, human, rational, scarred Isidora, was drowning in doubt. I am an Omega, she'd whispered to the darkness, to herself, to whatever forces had orchestrated this impossibility. Unwanted. Broken. How can I possibly be someone's mate? How can I be his mate? No answer came. Of course no answer came. The universe wasn't in the habit of explaining itself, especially not to the likes of her. Dawn broke cold and merciless, light filtering through the cabin's small window to illuminate the stranger in her bed, because that's where he was now, in her bed, the only place she had to put him. She'd spent the night huddled by the fire, wrapped in the one thin blanket she'd kept for herself, alternating between watching him and staring into the flames. He still hadn't woken. His breathing had evened out, his color had improved slightly, but he remained unconscious. Healing, her wolf assured her. His body was healing, drawing on reserves of strength that were impressive even for an alpha, and he was definitely an alpha. Everything about him screamed dominance and power. She'd made broth from the hare she'd caught, letting it simmer until the cabin filled with the rich scent of meat and herbs. She'd changed his bandages, marveling at how quickly the wounds were closing. Shifter healing was remarkable, but this was something else. This was the healing of someone extraordinarily powerful. It was midday when his eyes finally opened. She'd been sitting beside the bed, sewing a tear in one of her shirts, because life didn't stop just because she'd saved a dying alpha and discovered her mate bond, when she felt it. The shift in the air. The change in his breathing. She'd looked up to find amber eyes staring at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. You saved me, he said, and his voice was rough from disuse, deep and resonant in a way that vibrated through her bones. You were dying in my forest, she replied, proud that her voice didn't shake. What was I supposed to do? Let me die. He said it matter-of-factly, as if it were the obvious choice. It would have been safer for you. Probably, she agreed. But I've never been very good at doing what's safe. The corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close. I'm Orex, he said. Orex. The name meant nothing to her, and why should it? She'd been isolated for 5 years, cut off from pack politics and shifter society. She had no idea who the important players were, who ruled what territories, who commanded what forces. But her ignorance wouldn't last long. Orex Thrain, he continued, watching her face carefully. Alpha King of the Northern Packs. The Alpha King. The Alpha King. The ruler of the largest shifter coalition in the Northern Hemisphere. The most powerful alpha alive. And she, broken, cast out, worthless Isidora, had just saved his life. And he was her mate. The laugh that escaped her was half hysterical, edged with a bitterness that had been building for years. Of course, she said. Of course you are. Because apparently the universe has a sense of humor. He frowned, trying to sit up and wincing at the pull of his healing wounds. I don't understand. No, she said, standing abruptly and moving away from the bed, needing distance, needing space to breathe. You wouldn't. How could you? You're the Alpha King. You're the most powerful shifter alive. And she stopped, the words catching in her throat. You're my mate, he said quietly. I'm broken. The words exploded from her with more force than she'd intended, years of pain and shame and anger pouring out. I'm a defective Omega who was cast out by her pack because my wolf never emerged, because I never had a heat, because I was fundamentally, irrevocably wrong. That's who I am. That's what I am. And now you're going to tell me that I'm your mate, as if that makes sense, as if that's even possible. Silence filled the cabin. Orex stared at her, his expression unreadable, and Isidora waited for it. For the rejection. For him to say that there must be some mistake, that the bond must be false, that someone like her couldn't possibly be fated to someone like him. But instead, he said, your wolf has emerged now. She blinked. What? I can feel her, he said. Through the bond. She's there. She's been there all along, waiting. Waiting for me. The statement was so arrogant, so presumptuous, that it should have made her angry. Should have made her want to rage at him for suggesting that she'd needed him to be complete, that her wolf had been dormant because she hadn't found her mate yet. But the terrible thing was, it was true. Her wolf had been waiting. Had been sleeping, dormant, refusing to emerge until the right moment. Until him. That doesn't change anything, she said, but the words lacked conviction even to her own ears. It changes everything, Orex countered. Isidora, he paused, realizing. You never told me your name. Isidora Halver, she said. Nobody important. Nobody who matters. You matter to me. 4 words. 4 simple words that shouldn't have had the power to break her, but they did. They absolutely did. Because when had anyone ever said that to her? When had anyone ever looked at her like she was important, like she mattered, like she was worth something? The tears came before she could stop them, hot and angry and absolutely humiliating. She turned away, not wanting him to see, but she could feel him through the bond, could feel his concern, his desire to comfort, his frustration at being too weak to come to her. Why, she choked out. Why me? Out of all the she-wolves in the world, why would fate bind you to someone like me? I don't question fate, Orex said. I accept it. And if fate says you're mine, then you're mine. End of discussion. The presumption in his voice should have rankled. Should have made her want to argue, to fight, to assert her independence. But there was something else there too, something that sounded like certainty. Like acceptance. Like he'd looked at her, at who and what she was, and decided she was enough. I don't know how to do this, she admitted, still not looking at him. I don't know how to be anyone's mate. I don't know how to be a Luna. I don't even know how to be a proper Omega. Then we'll figure it out together. The simplicity of the statement made her laugh, a watery, broken sound that was half sob. You make it sound so easy. It won't be easy, he said. Nothing worthwhile ever is. But it will be worth it. She finally turned to look at him, this powerful alpha who was watching her with such intensity it made her heart race. You don't know me. I know enough, he said. I know you risked your life to save a dying stranger. I know you dragged me through a blizzard when you could have left me to freeze. I know you dug silver bullets out of my body and sat up all night making sure I kept breathing. That tells me everything I need to know about who you are. That tells you I'm an idiot who doesn't know when to mind her own business, Isidora said, but there was no heat in it. That tells me you're brave. Compassionate. Stubborn as hell. He smiled, a real smile this time, and the transformation it worked on his face was breathtaking. I'm starting to think fate knew exactly what it was doing. And there it was. The thing she'd been afraid to hope for, afraid to even consider. Acceptance. Not in spite of who she was, but because of it. But the moment of peace couldn't last. It never could. Because the world outside her cabin hadn't stopped turning just because she'd found her mate. And Orex was the Alpha King, his absence would be noted, would be investigated, would bring consequences crashing down on them like an avalanche. As if summoned by her thoughts, Orex's expression shifted. Became serious. Dark. Isidora, he said carefully. I need to tell you something. About why I was shot. About who's hunting me. And just like that, the brief respite of hope and possibility was shattered by the harsh reality of politics and power and betrayal. Someone in my own pack tried to kill me, Orex said, and the fury in his voice made the air in the cabin feel charged, dangerous. Someone close. Someone I trusted. They lured me away from my guards, ambushed me, and left me to die. Betrayal. Conspiracy. Exactly the kind of pack politics Isidora had fled to the mountains to escape. And now here it was, crashing into her sanctuary, dragging her back into a world she wanted no part of. Who, she asked, because what else could she say? I don't know, Orex admitted, and she could feel his frustration through the bond. There are several who might benefit from my death. Several who have been positioning themselves to challenge my authority. I thought I had time to root out the traitors, to secure my position before they made their move. I was wrong. What happens now? Isidora asked, though she already knew the answer. Already felt the weight of it settling over her like a shroud. I need to return to my kingdom, Orex said. I need to find the traitors before they realize I survived, before they can consolidate their power or make another attempt on my life. And you want me to come with you? It wasn't a question. Through the bond, she could feel what he wanted, what he needed. You're my mate, he said simply. My Luna. You belong at my side. I belong in these mountains, she countered, but even as she said it, she knew it was a lie. The mountains had been a refuge, a hiding place, but they'd never been home. Not really. How could they be when she'd been running from herself as much as from others? You belong with me, Orex said, his voice leaving no room for argument. The bond. The bond doesn't control me. The words burst out of her with surprising vehemence. I'm not some prize to be claimed, some possession to be carted back to your kingdom and put on display. I'm a person. I get to make my own choices. You're right, Orex said, and his immediate agreement took the wind out of her sails. You do get to make your own choices. So choose. Choose to come with me, not because the bond demands it, but because it's what you want. Choose to stand beside me, not as my possession, but as my equal. I'm not your equal, Isidora said bitterly. I'm an Omega. You're an Alpha King. We're not even in the same stratosphere. You're my mate, Orex repeated, with the patience of someone who was prepared to say it as many times as necessary until she believed it. That makes you my equal in every way that matters. She wanted to argue. Wanted to list all the reasons why this was insane, why she couldn't possibly fill the role he was asking her to take. But the truth was, and this was the terrifying part, she wanted to. Despite the fear, despite the certainty that she would fail, despite everything, she wanted to try. I'm afraid, she admitted quietly. Good, Orex said. Fear means you're smart enough to understand the risks. But fear doesn't have to be the end of the conversation. It can be the beginning. The beginning of what? The beginning of becoming who you were always meant to be. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility and promise and peril. Outside, the storm that had been raging for days was finally beginning to clear. Weak sunlight filtered through breaks in the clouds, turning the snow-covered landscape into something almost beautiful. But Isidora knew, they both knew, that this was just the eye of the storm. The real tempest was waiting for them beyond these mountains, in the kingdom where Orex ruled and enemies lurked in shadows. If I do this, she said slowly, if I agree to come with you, I need you to understand something. I won't be a decorative Luna who smiles and nods and lets you make all the decisions. I won't be silent when I disagree. I won't be content to stand in your shadow. I wouldn't want you to be, Orex said, and she could feel the truth of it through the bond. I've had enough of people who tell me what I want to hear. I need someone who will tell me the truth, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. Then you're in for a rough time, Isidora said dryly. Because I've got 5 years' worth of opinions I've been keeping to myself. I'm looking forward to it. And despite everything, despite the fear and the uncertainty and the absolute insanity of the situation, Isidora found herself smiling. Really smiling, in a way she hadn't in years. You're going to regret this, she warned. Never, Orex said with absolute conviction. The next few days were a strange sort of limbo. Orex was healing rapidly, faster than Isidora would have believed possible, but he wasn't yet strong enough to travel. And with the passes snowed in and visibility still poor, leaving the mountains was treacherous at best, suicidal at worst. So they waited. And in the waiting, they learned each other. Isidora discovered that Orex had a wry sense of humor, that he was surprisingly well-read despite spending most of his time managing pack politics and territorial disputes, that he had a weakness for the honey cakes she made from her precious store of honey and the coarse flour she ground herself. Orex learned that Isidora was far stronger than she gave herself credit for, That her years of isolation had made her resourceful and resilient, that beneath the layers of hurt and self-doubt was a core of steel that had kept her alive when anyone else would have given up. And through the bond, they felt each other in ways that went beyond words. Isidora could sense Orex's frustration at his own weakness, his burning need to return to his kingdom and root out the traitors before they could do more damage. Orex could feel Isidora's fear of the future, her terror of being found wanting, her deep-seated belief that she didn't deserve happiness. It was the fourth night of their strange cohabitation when Orex broached the subject they'd both been avoiding. "Tell me about your pack," he said. Isidora, who had been stirring a pot of stew over the fire, went still. "Why?" "Because I want to understand," Orex said. "I want to know what drove you to these mountains. What hurt you so badly that you chose exile over community?" "Does it matter?" she asked, not looking at him. "It matters to me." And that was the problem, wasn't it? It mattered to him. This powerful alpha, this king, cared about the pain of a nobody omega. Cared enough to ask, to listen, to try to understand. Isidora set down the wooden spoon she'd been using and came to sit across from him. The firelight played across her face, highlighting features that were more striking than beautiful, that spoke of hardship and determination rather than delicate refinement. "I don't remember my parents," she began. "They died when I was young, a hunting accident," they said, "though I've always wondered. The pack raised me, such as it was. I was fed and clothed and given a place to sleep, but I was never wanted." She paused, gathering her thoughts, and Orex waited patiently. He was good at that, she'd discovered. Good at giving her space to find her words. "When I turned 16 and my wolf didn't emerge, they said not to worry. Some omegas were late bloomers. But 17 came and went. 18. 20. By the time I was 22, it was clear that something was wrong with me. That I was defective." The word still tasted bitter on her tongue, all these years later. "They tried everything," she continued. "Rituals. Medicines. There was even talk of finding me a mate, hoping that the bond might trigger my first shift. But what alpha would want a broken omega? What alpha would saddle himself with a mate who couldn't give him the children he needed, who couldn't even properly function as her designation demanded?" "So you left," Orex said. "So I left," Isidora agreed. "Because staying meant watching everyone else live the life I was supposed to have. Staying meant enduring their pity, their whispers, their carefully averted eyes. At least in the mountains, the only one judging me was me. And was that better?" Orex asked gently. Isidora laughed, a harsh, broken sound. "No. Not really. Because turns out, I'm my own worst critic. At least the pack eventually got tired of talking about me. I never stopped thinking about it. And now? Now I don't know what to think," she admitted. "My wolf emerged. The thing everyone said was impossible happened. And I still don't understand why. What changed? Why now?" "You found your mate," Orex said. "Your wolf was waiting for me." "But why?" Isidora demanded, all the frustration and confusion of the past days bubbling to the surface. Why would she wait? Why would she let me suffer for years, let me be cast out and ridiculed and broken, instead of emerging sooner? What was the point of all that pain? "I don't know," Orex said honestly. "Maybe there is no point. Maybe it's just the random cruelty of fate. Or maybe," he paused, choosing his words carefully. "Maybe your wolf knew that you needed to be forged in fire before you could be what I need. What our pack will need." "That's a nice story," Isidora said bitterly. "But it doesn't make the pain retroactively meaningful. It doesn't make those years of isolation worth it." "No," Orex agreed. "It doesn't. Nothing can make that worth it. But it's done now. You can't change the past. You can only decide what you do with the future." And wasn't that the crux of it? The choice that she'd been dancing around ever since she'd pulled him from the snow, ever since the bond had snapped into place? She could let the past define her, could let the pain and rejection shape her into something small and bitter and broken. Or she could choose differently. Could choose to believe that maybe, just maybe, she was more than what she'd been told. "I'm still afraid," she said. "I know," Orex replied. "But you saved my life while afraid. You dragged me through a blizzard while afraid. You dug bullets out of my body while afraid. Fear doesn't seem to stop you from doing what needs to be done." "That's different," Isidora protested. "That was just survival. This is," she gestured helplessly, trying to encompass everything that coming with him would mean. "This is choosing to walk into the fire instead of running from it." "Yes," Orex said simply. "It is. And I'm asking you to do it anyway. I'm asking you to trust me, trust us, enough to try." Trust. Such a small word for such an enormous leap of faith. But looking at him, at this powerful alpha who had somehow become hers, Isidora felt something shift inside her. Felt the walls she'd built around her heart beginning to crack, to crumble, to fall away like the snow melting under spring sun. "Okay," she said quietly. "Okay?" Orex repeated, as if he couldn't quite believe what he'd heard. "Okay," Isidora confirmed, her voice growing stronger. "I'll come with you. I'll try. I can't promise I won't fail. Can't promise I won't embarrass you or make terrible decisions or completely fall apart under the pressure. But I'll try." The smile that broke across Orex's face was like sunrise after an endless night. "That's all I ask." He held out his hand to her, an invitation, an offer, a promise. Isidora looked at it for a long moment, at the scarred knuckles and calloused palms that spoke of a lifetime of fighting and leading and bearing the weight of a kingdom. Then she reached out and took it. The bond flared between them, bright and warm and achingly real. Through it, she could feel Orex's joy, his relief, his bone-deep certainty that this, she, was right. And beneath her own fear and doubt, she felt something else stirring. Something that might have been hope. "When do we leave?" she asked. "As soon as I'm strong enough to travel," Orex said. "Another day or two. The passes should be clear by then." 2 days, Isidora repeated. 2 days until her life changed irrevocably. 2 days until she walked away from the isolation that had been both prison and sanctuary. 2 days until she stepped into a role she had no idea how to fill. 2 days, Orex confirmed. "And Isidora? Thank you. For saving me. For choosing me. For being brave enough to try." She wanted to tell him that she wasn't brave, that she was terrified, that she was certain this was all going to end in disaster. But the words wouldn't come. Because maybe, just maybe, being brave didn't mean not being afraid. Maybe it meant being afraid and choosing to move forward anyway. The storm outside had finally cleared completely. Through the cabin's small window, Isidora could see stars emerging in a sky scrubbed clean by wind and snow. Beautiful and distant and eternal, they looked down on the world with the indifference of things that had seen civilizations rise and fall. But inside the cabin, 2 souls had found each other. Had chosen each other. And if the universe had any sense of poetry, that mattered more than all the distant stars combined. The next 2 days passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. Isidora gathered what few possessions she wanted to take, not much, after 5 years of living with the bare minimum. Some clothes. The knife that had served her so well. A small carved figure of a wolf that she'd made during a particularly lonely winter, whittling away at it until her fingers bled. She also prepared food for the journey, dried meat, hard cheese, journey bread that would keep for weeks. Orex watched her work with an expression that might have been fond, might have been amused. "We won't starve," he assured her. "The kingdom isn't that far once we're out of the mountains." "Humor me," Isidora said. "In the mountains, you prepare for the worst. Always." "Then I'll be grateful for your caution," Orex said. His strength was returning rapidly. By the second day, he was able to walk around the cabin without wincing, though Isidora noticed he still favored his left side where the worst of the silver wounds had been. She'd offered to check the injuries again, but he'd waved her off. Shifter healing, he'd said. I'll be fully recovered in another day or two. The silver slowed things down, but it's out of my system now. The evening before they were set to leave, Isidora stood outside the cabin for a long time, looking at the mountains that had been her home for 5 years. The peaks stood silent and eternal against the darkening sky, beautiful and terrible in their indifference. She'd been so certain, when she came here, that she would die in these mountains. That she would grow old alone, that her bones would eventually be scattered by scavengers, that she would be forgotten by everyone who had ever known her. Instead, she'd found her mate. Had discovered that her wolf had been there all along, waiting. Had been given a second chance at a life she'd thought was forever beyond her reach. Saying goodbye? Orex's voice came from behind her, warm and rough. Trying to, Isidora admitted. It's harder than I thought it would be. This place saved you, Orex said, coming to stand beside her. It's okay to be grateful for that, even as you leave it behind. It didn't save me, Isidora corrected. It just gave me a place to hide while I figured out how to save myself. And did you? Figure it out? Isidora thought about that. About the woman who had fled to these mountains 5 years ago, broken and ashamed and convinced of her own worthlessness. About the woman she was now, still afraid but choosing courage anyway. I'm working on it, she said finally. That night, their last night in the cabin, Isidora couldn't sleep. She lay in her makeshift bed by the fire. Orex had reclaimed the actual bed once he was strong enough, though he'd offered to share, an offer she'd declined with a blush that had made him laugh, and stared at the ceiling, her mind racing. Tomorrow, everything would change. Tomorrow, she would leave the safety of isolation and step into a world of politics and power and people who would judge her, who would find her wanting, who would whisper that the Alpha King deserved better than a broken Omega as his mate. Through the bond, she felt Orex's awareness of her distress. Felt him considering whether to say something or let her work through it alone. She appreciated that he chose silence, that he trusted her to come to him if she needed him. But the silence was also heavy with possibility, with unspoken promises and unacknowledged fears. They were bound now, tied together by fate and choice in equal measure. But what did that really mean? What did it mean to be someone's mate when you'd spent your entire life being told you weren't good enough for anyone? Isidora. Orex's voice cut through the darkness, quiet but clear. I can feel you spiraling. Sorry, she muttered. Don't apologize, he said. Just talk to me. Tell me what you're thinking. I'm thinking that this is insane, Isidora admitted. I'm thinking that I have no idea what I'm doing, that I'm going to fail spectacularly, that everyone is going to wonder what the hell you were thinking, binding yourself to someone like me. And I'm thinking, Orex said, that you're exactly what I need. What my kingdom needs. Someone who knows what it's like to be overlooked, to be underestimated, to fight for every scrap of dignity and respect. Someone who will see the Omegas and the weak and the vulnerable in my kingdom and actually give a damn about them, instead of just using them as political pawns. Isidora sat up, looking over at where he lay in the bed. In the dim firelight, she could just make out his profile, the strong lines of his face, the way his hair fell across the pillow. Is that what you think I'll do? She asked. Champion the weak? I think you'll do what's right, Orex said. Even when it's hard. Even when it's unpopular. Even when it costs you. You have a lot of faith in someone you barely know. I know enough, Orex said, echoing his words from days earlier. And the bond doesn't lie. I can feel your heart, Isidora. Your strength. Your compassion. Your stubborn refusal to give up even when giving up would be easier. That's what I know. That's what I trust. Isidora felt tears prick at her eyes. Damn him for saying exactly what she needed to hear, for seeing in her what she couldn't see in herself. Come here, Orex said softly. She hesitated only a moment before standing and crossing to the bed. Orex shifted over, making room for her, and when she lay down beside him, he wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. She could feel his heart beating against her back, steady and strong, a rhythm that spoke of life and survival and stubborn determination. We're going to face opposition, Orex said quietly. My enemies will use you against me. They'll question your fitness to be Luna, will spread rumors and lies designed to undermine both of us. It's going to be hard. I know, Isidora whispered. But we'll face it together, Orex continued. And Isidora? Anyone who tries to hurt you will answer to me. I protect what's mine. The possessiveness in his voice should have rankled, should have made her want to assert her independence. But instead, she found it comforting. After years of being no one's, of belonging nowhere, the idea of being claimed, of being protected, was intoxicating. Tomorrow, she said. Tomorrow we leave. Tomorrow we leave, Orex agreed. And you begin your new life. As my mate. As my Luna. As the woman who saved my life and stole my heart. I didn't steal anything, Isidora protested. You gave it freely. That I did, Orex said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. That I did. She fell asleep like that, wrapped in the arms of her mate, feeling safer than she had in years. And if her dreams were troubled by visions of the future, of courts and conspiracies and challenges she didn't know how to face, well, at least she didn't have to face them alone. Dawn came cold and clear. Isidora woke to find Orex already up, dressed in clothes she'd mended for him, rough mountain gear that was far cry from what an alpha king should wear, but it was all she had. He looked somehow both regal and wild, a king dressed as a commoner, power barely contained beneath humble cloth. Ready? He asked when he saw her stirring. Was she? Would she ever be? But she nodded anyway, because ready or not, it was time. They set out just after sunrise. The journey down from the mountains was treacherous, the paths were icy, the drop-off steep, and Isidora found herself grateful more than once for Orex's steadying hand when she slipped. He was fully healed now, his shifter strength returned, moving with a fluid grace that spoke of power barely leashed. It took most of the day to descend to the foothills. By the time they reached the tree line, where evergreens gave way to deciduous forest, the sun was already setting. They made camp in a small clearing, and Orex built a fire with practiced efficiency. How much farther? Isidora asked, warming her hands over the flames. 2 more days of travel, Orex said. Maybe less if the roads are clear. 2 days. 2 days until she walked into the royal court. 2 days until her new life truly began. That night, as they sat by the fire, Orex told her about his kingdom. About the sprawling palace that served as the seat of his power. About the complex web of pack alliances that held the northern territories together. About the enemies who had tried to kill him and the investigation that would need to be launched. I need to know who I can trust, Orex said. The betrayal came from within my inner circle. Someone close. Someone I relied on. Do you have suspects? Isidora asked. Several, Orex admitted. My beta, Theron, has been positioning himself for more power. My cousin, Rain, has never forgiven me for being named heir instead of him. And then there's the Council of Alphas, at least 3 of them have been vocal about their disagreement with my policies. What policies? Isidora asked, curious despite herself. I've been working to improve conditions for Omegas and lower-ranked pack members, Orex said. Limiting the hours they can be forced to work. Establishing protections against abuse. Ensuring they have representation in pack decisions. It's made me unpopular with certain alphas who prefer the old ways. Isidora stared at him, something warm and painful expanding in her chest. You're trying to change the system. I'm trying to make it better, Orex said. More just. But change threatens those who benefit from the current structure. It makes enemies. Enemies who would kill you, Isidora said quietly. Yes, Orex agreed. Which is why I need to root them out. Need to know who stands with me and who stands against me. And where do I fit into all this? Isidora asked. What role does a Luna play in pack politics? Whatever role you choose, Orex said. You could be a figurehead, attend ceremonies, smile for the crowds, stay out of the actual governance. Many Lunas choose that path. But? Isidora prompted, because she could hear the unspoken word. But I'd like you to be more, Orex admitted. I'd like you to be my partner. My advisor. Someone I can trust to tell me the truth, to see things I might miss, to advocate for those who have no voice. Because I was one of them, Isidora said. One of the voiceless. Because you understand them in a way I never can, Orex said. I've always had power. Always had status. I can sympathize with the struggles of Omegas and low-ranked pack members, but I can't truly understand. You can. You've lived it. Isidora thought about that. About the possibility of using her pain, her experience, to make things better for others like her. About having actual power to change the system that had broken her. It was terrifying. It was overwhelming. And it was also appealing. More than appealing. It gave meaning to the suffering, transformed it from random cruelty into something that could be used for good. I'll try, she said again, those same words she'd spoken days ago in the cabin, but this time they felt different. Felt like commitment rather than capitulation. That's all I ask, Orex said. They reached the capital on the afternoon of the third day. Isidora saw it first from a hillside overlook, a sprawling city of stone and wood, with a massive palace rising from its center like a mountain of marble and glass. Smoke rose from countless chimneys. Even from a distance, she could hear the sounds of a busy city, voices, hammers, the rumble of carts on cobblestone streets. It was both magnificent and terrifying. This was where she would live now. This was where she would try to become someone worthy of standing beside an alpha king. Are you ready? Orex asked, though they both knew the answer. No, Isidora said honestly. But let's do it anyway. They walked into the city together, and Isidora was immediately aware of the stairs. People stopped what they were doing to watch them pass, some with curiosity, some with recognition of their king, some with open speculation as they looked at her. Who is she? The glances seemed to ask. Why is she with our king? Isidora lifted her chin and kept walking, refusing to shrink under the weight of their scrutiny. Orex's presence beside her was a comfort, solid, unwavering, a constant reminder that she wasn't alone in this. The palace gates opened at their approach, guards snapping to attention as they recognized Orex. One of them, a grizzled alpha with a scar running down his face, stepped forward. Your Majesty, he said, relief evident in his voice. We feared, he stopped, his eyes flicking to Isidora and back to Orex. Assemble the council, Orex commanded. We have much to discuss. The guard nodded and hurried off, but not before one more glance at Isidora, assessing, curious, slightly judgmental. And so it begins, Isidora thought. The next hours were a whirlwind. Orex was swept up in reunions with advisors and guards, all of them demanding to know where he'd been, what had happened, who had attacked him. Isidora found herself relegated to the sidelines, watching as her mate transformed from the quiet, vulnerable man she'd known in the cabin to the commanding alpha king who ruled the northern territories. It was intimidating. This was who he really was. This power, this authority, this absolute confidence in his right to command. The man in her cabin had been Orex stripped down to his essentials. This was Orex in his element. And she was supposed to stand beside him. Was supposed to be his equal. The doubt that had been building since they left the mountains crystallized into certainty. She couldn't do this. Couldn't possibly fill the role he needed her to. She was a nobody, a broken Omega, a woman who had fled to the mountains rather than face the world. What was she doing here? Isidora. Orex's voice cut through her spiral. He'd broken away from his advisors and was coming toward her, his expression concerned. Through the bond, she knew he could feel her panic, her overwhelming sense of inadequacy. I can't do this, she whispered when he reached her. Yes, you can, he said firmly. Look at them, Isidora said, gesturing to the assembled court. Look at how they see me. I'm nothing to them. Less than nothing. You're everything to me, Orex said. And that's what matters. Is it? Isidora challenged. Is it really? Or am I a liability? A weak point your enemies can exploit? Orex's eyes flashed, not with anger at her, but at the very suggestion. You are not weak. You are not a liability. You are my mate, my Luna, and anyone who suggests otherwise will answer to me. But. No, Orex cut her off. No more doubts. No more fear. You saved my life, Isidora. You dragged me through a blizzard, dug silver out of my body, fought through your own exhaustion to keep me alive. If that's not strength, I don't know what is. That was different, Isidora protested weakly. It wasn't, Orex said. It's the same strength. The same determination. The same refusal to give up. You just need to trust it. Trust yourself. Before Isidora could respond, a woman appeared beside them, tall, elegant, with the bearing of an alpha and ice blue eyes that assessed Isidora with cold calculation. So, she said, her voice smooth as silk and just as dangerous. This is the Omega who has captured our king's attention. Isidora felt herself bristle at the tone, at the way the woman emphasized Omega like it was an insult. This is Isidora Halver, Orex said, his voice hard. My mate. Your Luna. And you will show her the respect she deserves, Rain. Rain. His cousin. One of his suspects. Of course, cousin, Rain said, though her smile didn't reach her eyes. Welcome to the court, Isidora. I'm sure you'll find it very educational. It was a threat. Veiled, polite, but unmistakable. Rain was telling her that she didn't belong, that she would be tested, that she would likely be found wanting. And you know what? That made Isidora angry. Made her furious, actually. Because she'd spent too many years letting people make her feel small, letting their judgment define her worth. She'd come here terrified and doubting, but this casual contempt, this assumption that she could be intimidated, ignited something inside her. I'm sure I will, Isidora said, meeting Rain's eyes steadily. Learn a lot, I mean. About who my true allies are. And who I need to watch carefully. Rain's smile faltered just slightly. Good. Let her know that the broken Omega had teeth. I look forward to getting to know you better, Rain said, recovering. There's so much I could teach you about court life. I'm sure there is, Isidora said. Just as I'm sure Orex chose me for reasons that go beyond what you might think appropriate. Fortunately, it's not your approval I need. Rain's eyes flashed with something that might have been anger, might have been respect. Indeed. Well. I'll leave you to settle in. I'm sure we'll have many opportunities to chat. She swept away, leaving Isidora feeling slightly shaky but also triumphant. She'd stood her ground. Hadn't backed down. Hadn't let herself be intimidated. Well done, Orex murmured, and she could feel his pride through the bond. Was that stupid? Isidora asked. Making an enemy of her right away? She was already your enemy, Orex said. You just let her know you won't be an easy target. That's smart, not stupid. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of introductions and barely veiled hostility. Isidora met the Council of Alphas, 6 powerful pack leaders who advised Orex on matters of governance and territory. Some were openly skeptical of her. Others were polite but distant. None were welcoming. She met Theron, Orex's beta, a massive alpha with shrewd eyes who seemed to be reserving judgment. She met servants and advisors and guards, all of whom looked at her with varying degrees of curiosity and doubt. And through it all, she felt the weight of expectations pressing down on her. The silent questions, who is she? Why her? Is she strong enough? Smart enough? Good enough? By the time Orex finally led her to their quarters, a suite of rooms that was larger than her entire cabin, Isidora was exhausted. Not physically, though the day had been long, but emotionally. Mentally. She felt wrung out, scraped raw, like every insecurity had been exposed and examined. I know it's overwhelming, Orex said gently, watching her take in the opulent bedroom with its massive four-poster bed, the attached sitting room with its plush furniture and roaring fireplace, the bathing room that was practically a small spa. "This is your life," Isidora said, gesturing to the luxury surrounding them. "How do I fit into this?" "You make it your life too," Orex said. "You claim it. Make it yours." "I don't know how," Isidora admitted, the exhaustion making her honest in a way she wouldn't normally be. Orex crossed to her, cupping her face in his hands and forcing her to meet his eyes. "Then learn. You learn to survive in the mountains. You learn to hunt, to trap, to live alone. You can learn this too. And if I fail? Then you get up and try again," Orex said. "That's all any of us can do." He kissed her then, the first kiss they'd shared since the bond snapped into place. It was gentle, achingly tender, and it made Isidora's heart clench with emotion she didn't have words for. When he pulled back, he rested his forehead against hers. "You are enough, Isidora. You've always been enough. The world just failed to see it." And maybe, just maybe, she could start to believe that. Could start to see herself not as the broken Omega she'd been told she was, but as the woman who'd survived, who'd fought, who'd saved an Alpha King and found her mate and was now standing on the precipice of a new life. "Stay with me tonight," she whispered. Not a question. A plea. "Always," Orex promised. "For as long as you'll have me." They fell asleep tangled together in the massive bed, the bond humming between them like a living thing. And if Isidora's dreams were still troubled by visions of hostile courts and lurking enemies, at least she woke to the solid reality of Orex beside her, warm and real and hers. The days that followed were a trial by fire. Isidora was thrown into the deep end of court life with no preparation, no training, no idea what she was doing. She made mistakes, called people by the wrong titles, violated protocols she didn't know existed, said things that were too blunt or too emotional for the carefully controlled political arena. But she also began to find her footing. Began to understand the currents of power that flowed through the court, the alliances and enmities that shaped every interaction. She learned which servants could be trusted, which advisors were loyal to Orex, which alphas were actively working against him. And she discovered something else: her experience as an outcast, as someone who'd been overlooked and underestimated, gave her insights that others missed. She noticed the Omega servants who flinched when certain alphas approached. Saw the fear in the eyes of low-ranked pack members when they thought no one was watching. Understood the power dynamics that those who'd always had power took for granted. She started speaking up. Started advocating for changes, small ones at first. Better working conditions for servants. Protection against the casual cruelty that passed for normal treatment of Omegas. A voice for those who had none. It made her unpopular with certain segments of the court. The old guard alphas who liked things the way they were. The traditionalists who thought an Omega, even a Luna, had no business interfering in governance. The opportunists who saw her as a threat to their power. But it also won her allies. The Omegas who saw her as one of them who'd risen. The progressive alphas who agreed with Orex's vision of change. The servants who whispered her name with something that sounded like hope. 3 weeks into her new life, Isidora stood before the Council of Alphas, at Orex's request, to present a proposal for reforming Omega rights within the packs. Her hand shook as she held the document she'd spent days preparing. Her voice wavered at first as she began to speak. But then she found her rhythm. Found her anger, righteous and burning, at the injustices she'd experienced and seen. Found her conviction that things could be better, should be better. "You're asking us to fundamentally alter pack structure," one of the alphas, a grizzled old wolf named Cade, interrupted. "To give Omegas rights they've never had. Power they've never wielded. I'm asking you to treat them like people," Isidora shot back, her fear forgotten in the face of his contempt. "Not property. Not conveniences. People with thoughts and feelings and inherent worth." "And what would you know of pack structure?" another alpha sneered. "You, who were cast out. Who lived alone for years. who has no experience with actual governance. I know what it's like to be disposable, Isidora said, her voice steady now, strong. I know what it's like to be told you're broken, that you're worthless, that your pain doesn't matter. And I know that a pack that treats its weakest members with contempt is a weak pack. A broken pack. No matter how powerful its alphas might be. Silence fell over the council chamber. Orex watched her with an expression that might have been pride, might have been love, might have been both. The Luna speaks with passion, Theron said carefully. But passion alone doesn't make policy. Then let's talk policy, Isidora said, and began laying out her proposal in detail, the protections, the rights, the mechanisms for enforcement. It wasn't perfect. She knew that. But it was a start. A first step toward the kind of world she wished had existed when she was young and broken and alone. The debate raged for hours. Some alphas supported her. Others fought her tooth and nail. But by the end of it, 3 of her proposals had been accepted, small victories, but victories nonetheless. As the council dispersed, Orex approached her, his eyes warm. You were magnificent. I was terrified, Isidora admitted. You were both, Orex said. Magnificently terrified. Terrifyingly magnificent. Take your pick. Isidora laughed, a real laugh, bright and genuine, and felt something in her chest unfurl. Hope, maybe. Or confidence. Or just the simple satisfaction of having fought for something and not completely failed. This is just the beginning, she said. I know, Orex replied. And I can't wait to see what comes next. That night, as they lay together in their enormous bed, Isidora thought about how far she'd come. From the broken Omega in the mountains to the Luna standing before the Council of Alphas, demanding change. It felt impossible. It felt inevitable. It felt like coming home to a place she'd never known existed. I love you, Orex murmured into the darkness. Isidora's breath caught. They hadn't said the words before, had danced around them, implied them through actions and the bond, but never spoken them aloud. I love you too, she whispered back, and felt the truth of it settling into her bones. This powerful alpha, this king, this man who'd seen her at her lowest and chosen her anyway. How could she not love him? The bond flared between them, brighter than ever, and Isidora finally understood what it meant. Not possession. Not ownership. But partnership. Unity. 2 souls that had been wandering alone finally finding their way home to each other. The investigation into the assassination attempt eventually bore fruit. It was Rain, Orex's cousin, consumed by jealousy and ambition, who had orchestrated the attack. She'd allied with 2 of the Council Alphas and Orex's former advisor, a snake named Kale, to stage the ambush. The trial was public and brutal. Rain was stripped of her rank and exiled, a mercy, some said, given that execution would have been justified. The 2 Council Alphas were removed from power. Kale simply disappeared, and no one asked too many questions about what had become of him. With the traitors rooted out, Orex's position became more secure. And with it, so did Isidora's. She was no longer the mysterious Omega the king had brought home. She was the Luna who had fought for Omega rights. Who had stood before the council and demanded change. Who had proven herself through action rather than words. Did everyone accept her? No. There were still those who whispered that she wasn't good enough, wasn't worthy, wasn't fit to be Luna. But their voices grew quieter as the months passed and Isidora continued to prove them wrong. She established a Council of Omegas to parallel the Council of Alphas, giving voice to those who had been voiceless. She created protections against abuse and exploitation. She pushed for education and opportunity for low-ranked pack members. She made enemies, certainly, but she also made the world better in small, incremental ways. And through it all, Orex stood beside her. Not in front of her, shielding her from criticism. Not behind her, letting her fight alone. But beside her, as partners, as mates, as equals. 6 months after she'd walked into the capital, Isidora stood on the palace balcony, looking out over the city that had become her home. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, and she felt content. Not perfectly happy, life was too complicated for that, but content in a way she'd never imagined possible. "What are you thinking?" Orex asked, joining her on the balcony. "I'm thinking," Isidora said slowly, "that I'm glad I saved you. That night in the snow. I'm glad I didn't leave you to die." "I'm fairly glad about that too," Orex said dryly. Isidora smiled. "I'm thinking that maybe being broken was just being unfinished. That my wolf was waiting because I needed to become who I am now before she could emerge. That all the pain and isolation and struggle wasn't meaningless. It was preparation." "A nice way of looking at it," Orex said. "Is it true?" Isidora asked. "Or am I just making up stories to make the past hurt less? Does it matter?" Orex countered. "You can't change what happened. You can only decide what it means. What you do with it." And wasn't that what she'd been doing all along? Taking the pain, the rejection, the years of believing she was worthless, and transforming them into something useful. Something powerful. Using her experience to help others, to change the system, to make the world a little less cruel. "I'm not broken anymore," Isidora said, the words feeling like truth for the first time. "You were never broken," Orex said. "Just healing. And now you're whole." Isidora turned to look at him, this man who had seen her at her lowest and loved her anyway. This alpha who had stood beside her as she fought to change the world. This mate who had given her not just acceptance, but a purpose. "Thank you," she said. "For waiting for me. In the snow. In life. For being patient while I figured out who I was supposed to be." "Thank you," Orex replied, "for saving me. In more ways than you know." They stood together on the balcony as night fell, two souls bound by fate and choice, by pain and healing, by a love that had survived blizzards and betrayals and the crushing weight of self-doubt. And if Isidora still had days when she felt inadequate, when the old voices whispered that she wasn't enough, well, she had Orex to remind her. Had the changes she'd made to remind her. Had her own strength to remind her. She'd been the Omega cast out, the broken wolf, the woman who fled to the mountains to escape judgment. But she'd become so much more. Had transformed pain into power, isolation into empathy, brokenness into wholeness. She'd saved an alpha king. And in doing so, she'd saved herself. And really, wasn't that the point of the whole damn story? That sometimes the person who needs saving the most is yourself. That sometimes strength comes from surviving what should have broken you. That sometimes the very things that make you feel worthless are what make you invaluable. Isidora Halver was no longer just an Omega. She was a Luna. A mate. A force for change in a world that desperately needed it. And she was finally, beautifully, achingly enough.